potential for specialist oils, what I wanted to do is just to outline where I'm coming from in terms of this presentation, because part of the introduction, I wanted to just explain to you what premium crops is all about and where we see some of these potential crops and how they might work. I'd also like to go through just some of the crops and things we are looking at and ones that we're not. Suggest why some of them will be successful and some of them won't. Question where those markets are in that success, and also just a couple of slides on what the future might look like and things that we're keeping an eye on. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about premium crops just to set it in context, because we are providing multiple links in the supply chain already. Basically, for growers, we are sourcing varieties and crop species. We're supplying the seed of those species to the farmer, and we are buying back the crop from the farmer in order to supply that to an end user. So in that context, we are contracting and trading 50% of the UK's linseed crop. We're about 50% of the UK's high-rubic acid rapeseed crop, and about 90% of the canary seed crop for the birdseed market. I should make a distinction, that's not canary grass, that's canary seed, which is the annual stuff that produces a grain. Lots of other things that we do. We are contracting forage, red wheat, naked oats. I think it gives you a flavour of the sort of added value crops that we're trading in and we're involved with. For industry customers, as far as they're concerned, we're sourcing the material for them. Sometimes we're processing that material. We sell quite a lot of our high-rubic rapeseed as oil, and we're supplying that to them. We are contracting 50% of the UK's linseed crop, but we actually trade about 75% of the UK's linseed crop. Most of that is not going for oil. Most of it is going for high omega-3 animal feed. We're exporting probably 90% of our production into that sort of market. So most of the linseed crop is not for oil. High-rubic acid for its high-rubic content, and as I mentioned, canary seed for the birdseed market. One of the things I should say is one of what our industry customers are looking for, and the reason why we've managed to grow our canary seed market as much as we have, is because those guys were importing that material from Canada largely. And because it came from Canada on a great big ship, they had to buy all that crop way in advance. And when it arrives, they then got stacks of the stuff to store for months on end with all the capital and cash tied up, which meant that although they could buy it at pretty much the same price or slightly less than we would supply it to them, we can supply it to them on a weekly truck-by-truck basis. We can hold on to the logistics and the storage and all that side of things, which frees up an awful lot of their capital in that process. But one of the things we had to prove was that we could maintain a consistent and reliable quality supply of product to that market. So just moving on, what are the specialist oils? And I just wanted to try and define that. There's an oil that has a certain set of characteristics that customers will actively seek to purchase because of those characteristics. In the context of agriculture, and especially this presentation, from our point of view, the specialist oils must come from arable crops. So I'm focusing that down into an arable crop situation. Importantly, and one thing that we find is that when we get customers who want these specialty oils, and they know they want them, because they're running factories or supplying their customers downstream, they are one of the most important things is that they have that supply and that consistent supply, and they are willing to pay a premium for it. Just wanted to talk about the chicken and egg conundrum. The chicken's the market and the egg's the product. You can't have one without the other. effectively, when we're looking at commercial viability of any novel crop, and particularly the specialist oils, we need both. We need them both at the same time. A great product with unique characteristics is useless if we can't sell it or if we can't produce it, and that's a very important element as well. We need to be able to grow it economically in the UK climate on a UK arable situation. And at every link in that supply chain, all the stakeholders need to see a profit, and it needs to be spread pretty evenly through that chain. So what are the prerequisites? From a production point of view, I've touched on those. But a crop species or variety that can be grown in the UK, it needs to produce a yield that is economically viable. It was interesting listening to the other presentations earlier where they're talking about using hemp, for example, but the value of that hemp needs to match with the price that the end user's willing to pay for it. And if the grower can't achieve the yield to make that work, then the value for cultivation and use as far as he's concerned is pretty useless. We also need to be able to grow it. And apart from the environment, which we touched upon just now, inputs are becoming a very, very crucial element. I don't know if you've noticed, but politically, crop protection products are taking a right hammering at the moment. And certainly from a novel crops point of view, that is making life very, very difficult indeed. Post-Brexit, the major ag chem companies are already saying that if they apply for a crop protection product in Europe, they might apply for 3 major crops. But because the UK is a little island in the northwest corner of Europe and has now said it insists on having its own registration, the cost of registration of that product, they might only put 1 major crop for the UK. That means for all the other crops, we need to produce an extension of use application. And as soon as you start going down the line of extension of use applications, you start looking at small, medium enterprises having to do an awful lot of work to get a crop protection product to work on a minor crop in this market. So it's a huge investment, an added investment that we really could do without. And even on minor crops today, we're working in the Cicero project on chickpeas, for example. One of the primary things we're looking at is herbicides. Can we find any herbicides that we can use? Bit of a challenge. And then hemp's a classic example, the equipment to be able to handle those crops. We deal with borage quite a bit. You know, being able to harvest borage requires a farmer to have a draper header or that sort of thing, which is why we tend to focus most of our attention commercially on crops that can be grown on an arable farm with arable equipment without major investment in lots of extra machinery. The other thing is it needs to be able to be moved, stored, and sometimes stored separately, especially when you're talking about specialty oils. You can't have double low rapeseed and high rusic rapeseed stored in the same store, as a classic example. So we need to be able to keep those separate. And of course, we need to be able to process those crops. So the technology of processing them needs to be in place as well. From a market point of view, I've touched upon this, and we've seen a lot of it historically as well. Probably a good example of a specialty oil in recent years that has seen some pretty ups and downs has been high oleic low linolenic, the whole market. When it came through, the general manager at ADM, 50% of the UK's crushing capacity, said, if I could get whole oilseed rape from the UK reliably without damaging the yield, I would switch the entire crush to whole because my market would take it. The problem was he couldn't necessarily source it reliably, and at the time it was only coming from 1 breeder, so he didn't want to limit his yield capacity by preventing the other breeders from having an access to the marketplace. So there are limitations in terms of that. The other problem was that in the initial stages of whole introduction, the end users were looking for the high oleic characteristic and the low linolenic because of the frying properties that that oil conveys. But they can get that characteristic from high oleic sunflowers cheaper than they can get it from higher laid rapeseed. So where the market in rapeseed went up to begin with, the sunflowers came in and completely undermined that market. So all of a sudden, all the contracts for that market disappeared, which made the market very unstable, quite unreliable. And growers that had gone into that market were suddenly faced with crops that was no longer wanted. It is, I hasten to add, coming back, that market, and we've learned a few lessons from it. But it's an example of a potentially large specialist oil that hit the market problem at the beginning. Value, the market needs to have a value in it, and that's determined by the market price of the product as well as the size of the market overall. A lot of products, especially specialty oils, borage, for example, is a classic. We're trading borage at the moment at about £3,500 a tonne. Big high value. It only yields about half a tonne a hectare, but that still produces a decent gross margin to the grower. Now, when the borage price, when the Chinese come into the market and push the price up, that's where we are. The Chinese are satisfied, they've produced enough of their own, the market can drop to below £2,000 a tonne, and then suddenly there's no market. So the market price is crucial. It needs to be steady, and it needs to have a match with that volume production. Mentioned about predictable. When you're placing contracts with growers, especially for something like oilseed rape, we are talking to growers in June this year about harvest 24? Yeah, we'll be talking to growers about harvest product in 24. So we're 18 months in advance that we're having to talk to those growers about contracts for that market. So we need to be able to know that that market is going to be there in 18, 24 months' time. So we've got to talk to the end users and secure that sale that far in advance. So it needs to be predictable. And of course, the other thing, the sunflower example is a good one in terms of whole. It needs to be resilient. It needs to be able to take the knocks if competitors come along or competitive markets come along. I think another classic example of that was probably the evening primrose markets a couple of decades ago, where the market was growing because it was producing a high omega-3 content. And then suddenly the fish oil price came along, a lot cheaper, and undermined the entire market. So it needs to be resilient in terms of being able to fight off competition. I'm being brutal here, I'm afraid. Some examples, I've mentioned a few already, of mainstream specialist oils we already know about: high russic acid rapeseed. I've mentioned high oleics, low oilseed rape, and sunflowers. Incidentally, I think the global market for sunflowers is now about 85 or 90% high oleic sunflowers. So they really have surpassed the old version. Mentioned borage. We're involved very heavily, as I mentioned, with linseed. And incidentally, most of our linseed is going into animal feed. It's the fatty acid profile of the oil that is what the animal guys want. So they want the high omega-3 oil content. We've now got varieties that are producing ALA contents in excess of 70%, and our end users are paying a premium for the high ALA content over and above the standard linseed. They already wanted standard linseed, now they're paying a premium for the extra. But it's the oil characteristic. We don't even have to crush the seed, we just sell the seed. They want the oil. Some of the other markets that are out there, we've already heard about hemp quite a lot today, and there is a hemp oil market out there. Echium, there's a small acreage every now and again. Niger is one that's probably not really grown here, but there is a potential. Safflower, evening primrose, camelina, meadow foam, cranberry, the list goes on. I ran out of space, really. What I really wanted to do was just to point out a little bit about what those characteristics are. You'll see that very often, from an oil point of view, a lot of these markets are about the omega content, omega-3, 6, and 9. 3 being the one that is the closest to fish oil at various stages of the development of approaching EPA and DHA. I haven't put, actually, don't think I put argyflower on that list, the buglosoides, perhaps because it should have been on the previous one. A lot of, as I say, a lot of these markets are looking at those sort of characteristics. There are a few of the markets that I'm looking more for flavour or just straight biodiesel use in terms of it's a replacement for fossil fuel oils. Just wanted to place those crops into some very big groups of where those end markets sit. The food and feed uses tend to be the omegas, the omega-3, 6 and 9. The industrial uses, that tends to be the biodiesel, or it could be the longer chain fatty acid material for high erucic rapeseed. Cosmetics, a very specialist market in terms of the kind of characteristics they want the oil to perform as, whether it's a hardening oil or a lubricity or something like that that comes up. But if we just sort of place some of those crops into the group, got argyflower on there, of their major markets, linseed kind of half straddles food and feed versus industrial, but most of them, there's very few that we can find that actually sit exclusively in the cosmetics end of the sector, from a major crop market opportunity point of view. But much of that is because the cosmetics, and I think some of that is the link up between the cosmetics and pharmaceutical guys and botanists. They're a bunch of chemists and they're asking questions about chemistry, and we're a bunch of botanists and we know very little about chemistry, but they don't know very much about plants. So I think there is a communication disconnect there between those two markets that we need to start to bridge if we're going to exploit that end. The other thing is cosmetics markets by their nature tend to be quite small. And I'll talk about size of market in a moment. So what I thought was interesting was, obviously, mentioned this before, food and feed uses tends to be about the omegas. On the other side, industrial uses and cosmetics tends to be about the actual physical properties of the oil, lubricity, whether it's a drying oil, for paints and polymers, those sort of characteristics, and also long-term stability in terms of oxidative stability. A couple of big red circles where not many crops appear. There aren't many, perhaps understandably, that straddle industrial and food and feed. 9 times out of 10, that's because the things that are defined as industrial are usually toxic to people anyway. So we don't get many that straddle both. And as I've already talked about the cosmetics market. This is a little bit of my presentation from the point of view of the detail on this. Please don't get hung up on the fine tuning of the numbers. It was more about trying to illustrate the relative size of some of these markets and where the opportunities lie. If I said to you that the high erucic acid rapeseed market in the UK occupies about 30,000 to 35,000 hectares, the whole market at the moment is probably not far behind. Linseed market, probably a little bit smaller than that, around the 20,000 to 25,000 hectare market. Set that in context, wheat, 2 million. So when we're talking about some of the biggest, and I've talked about mainstream specialist oil markets, we're a drop in the ocean, pardon the pun, compared with where we are on wheat in terms of cropping areas. So if wheat catches a cold, we get the flu or COVID, you know, in terms of where some of these markets, how fragile some of these markets can be. Mentioned about borage, for example, that's about 5,000 hectares. I put argyflower in as slightly bigger because I've tried to indicate both the combination of the value and the size of the market and the bubble size there. And argyflower has quite a potential value, although the area grown at the moment is quite small. I think it's a fascinating crop species. It's probably the closest the best novel crop that I've seen come into the market in the 30 years that I've been in the industry. It actually sits quite well in the rotation. We can produce it, and it has a lot of potential in terms of end-use markets. At the moment, because of the value and because of the productivity, it's kind of limited to the health food end of the sector, because that's where the high price sits. If we can produce more ahi flour per hectare, drive down the commodity price, the potential for that to go into further food markets is enormous. Just getting a flag. So I just wanted to illustrate on here basically where the value lies. Oil price, cosmetics going up there. Food, I'm afraid, they're all very similar in terms of where the price sits. So from an evaluation, when evaluating a crop coming through, if we're targeting the food market, production-wise, they all sit very similar. And I thought that was an interesting coincidence, maybe, but probably also an indicator that for food, we've got to bear in mind people aren't going to pay endless amounts of money for the food. There'll be alternatives. So there's a glass ceiling in there in terms of the price. For industry, we're even lower. So we need to have a high productivity crop that we can produce at a relatively low price. Also use this slide just to say, this is the zone of where most of the development species that we've heard about today sit. The specialty oil crops, the camellinas, the echiums, the meadow foams, they probably sit in the small end of the market. So in order to be profitable, they're going to need to be somewhere up here in terms of grain price, unless we can produce 4 tonne a hectare from them. So we've got to be careful as to where they sit. The other thing I wanted to say about markets is that there is a market out there that is the fossil fuel lubricants market, the biofuels market, the marine oils market. They are huge. I did some number crunching a few years back where I just took the official figures for UK DERV consumption, road transport diesel. I said, if we wanted to supply that with biodiesel, how much rapeseed would we need to grow in a single year? And it was the entire UK arable acreage twice in order to supply the UK DERV requirement. So there are some huge markets out there, but if we can't supply them, what's the point? We need to make these crops relatively niche within their global markets, because we're not going to be able to do it any other way. The other thing in the back of my mind is, for every hectare that goes into DERV, we've got one less hectare of food. So there are potential markets out there, especially when we start to look at the unknowns. 30 seconds. There are lots of emerging markets. We're hearing about some of the domestic products with all these plant-based ingredients. I've never quite worked out what the plant-based ingredient is, but he says it very loudly in the advert. We've got lots of stuff going on about vegan recipes, and it's particularly interesting, but not so much for oils, but particularly for proteins. Net zero industrial products. It was interesting. Last week, they flew across the Atlantic with the first 100% bio-renewable aviation fuel. And also, one other thing that we're keeping a very close eye on, government, Royal Society very recently presented this to government about enabling genetic technologies. Government are certainly very open to bringing in gene editing technology. But we can start bringing in gene editing technology. 20 years to produce a willow variety. Actually, if we start putting markers in it, you can make it 2. So there's a lot of stuff that we can do to open up these markets and put chemistry and put the right characteristics in. And the other one is biodiversity. I think it's really interesting. They found that a new species of the thing that's named after David Attenborough, the egg-laying mammal. there are species out there we haven't found yet. So let's keep biodiversity. Let's keep looking. That's where ahi flower came from. We don't know. It's an unknown unknown. So in summary, they already exist. There's a scope for a lot more. Limitations of species and markets, and a lot of future opportunities could lie in new markets, gene editing, smart farming, you name it. Lots of opportunity. And there's things we probably haven't found yet. Thank you very much.